could say, how old are you? But if you're a millennial, the majority of your life has been spent in a country at war. How did we get that? How come America has spent most of the century fighting two wars it is never going to win? Wasting its resources, distorting its economy, perhaps precipitating the worst economic crisis since a depression. And you know, if only they had listened to historians. Most historians said, you know, invading Iraq has not really worked in the past. Bombing Afghanistan really didn't work for the Russians, did it? You know, I think if you look carefully at past parallels, if you look at how things happen and try to understand it, if you try and get the big picture, you may avoid repeating some of the errors. I don't think the past tells you what to do. It may well tell you what not to do. And that's a very valuable skill. It seems to me that history does two things. The first is it is a window on the past. It can show you the things that have happened. You can find out a great deal about how things happen, because human nature has not changed all that much. I believe at West Point, it's obligatory to read Thucydides, because his account of human nature in his book on the Peloponnesian War is still valid today, the way in which he shows the different forces. Now, of course, it's a self-serving book. Thucydides is a defeated commander. He's captured. He interviews Spartans as well as Athenians, and that's part of the charm of his book, but it's still a really good example of how to provide a rounded account of events in the past, which can talk to us today. So I think that's the first reason you need history. It shows you how also to be prepared for the unexpected. It shows you how important it is to know what isn't there, as well as what is. But I think the second main use is there is some predictive power. And I think it works like this. As you know, I've written recently on the global crisis of the 17th century, and in the course of that I try to look at two archives: the human archive, written diaries, letters, documents, archaeological records. One of my favorites in the 1640s is there's a bridge in Basel on the Rhine where they mark the highest floodwater. And you can then see from this record, the epigraphy, if you like, you can see just which are the worst years, and the worst years ever in the 1640s. Well, that's a very interesting statistic, but it's still from the human archive. Second archive I tried to use, I call the natural archive, which are things like tree ring records, the records of ice cores. At the Ohio State University where I teach, we have the Bird Polar Research Institute, where they have got bores which go all the way down through glaciers, through the polar ice caps, and they measure the annual deposits. And from that they can deduce a great deal by the analysis of what's in that annual deposit. They can tell a great deal about the changing climate year by year, decade on decade, century by century, millennium on millennium. They have, I think, 7,000 years of records. So trying to bring those two together enabled me to make some predictions, but normally predictions are made by where are we now, where are we going to be in 10 years? That's what sociologists do, that's what political scientists do, international relations. They try, if you like, if you see history as a tape, they want to fast forward. I want to learn by rewinding the tape to see what happened then and say, well, so this is a more likely scenario. In the case of climate change, we can't ignore the year 1816, the year without a summer, which sees the most catastrophic weather conditions in Europe and Northeast America in particular, and in other areas too. But it's caused this unique aberration of recent times is caused by the eruption of a volcano in Indonesia. It's a huge volcanic eruption, but it has these effects all over Europe and all over Northeast America. And the state where I live, Ohio, and the state where we are now, Illinois, owe a great deal to the eruption of the Tambora volcano, because it killed off agriculture in the Northeast. And men and women and families marched off their farms in New England and came to the golden Ohio country, as the speculators said. And if you look at the population movement in the three states, Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, you'll find that there's a huge upsurge in immigration in 1817, 1818, and 1819 as a direct result of this one climatic aberration. And I think by learning from that and how suddenly climate change can affect lives, we know that we need to start organizing for the next disaster. We don't know when it will happen, but we do know that it's coming. And so we could do a little better. Let me give you a concrete example. In England, when I was growing up, there was a terrible flood in 1953, a combination of very, very heavy rainfall, very, very high storm tides, and huge winds which blew the North Sea further and further and further into Channel. So in the end, it floods Holland, Belgium, and southeast England. And the loss of life, mercifully, is not much. 2,000 people in Holland, 200 people in England, but the destruction of property is catastrophic. And governments around the North Sea said, never again, we need to prepare for this, we need to do something. And of course, there's opposition from local governments who have to pay for it. There's opposition from the shipping interests, because the last thing they want is barriers on the waterways. So it takes 30 years before the process even begins. But in the end, you get the huge barrier across the Oosterschelde in the Netherlands, and you get the Thames barrier in England. It's still there, and in the winter 2013, 2014, it was activated 30 times because there was a risk of catastrophic flooding. Now, we had Superstorm Sandy here in 2012. I'm speaking to you now in November 2015, 3 years later. To the best of my knowledge, virtually nothing has been done to prepare against the inevitable repeat of a storm surge like that. And I just can't understand why. I mean, it's always cheaper to prepare than to repair.